All right, welcome to Indymedia on Air. And today I have a very special guest in studio who is visiting from Canada. Dr. Anthony J. Hall is Professor of Globalization Studies at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada. He's the author of The American Empire and the Fourth World, which introduces the series The Bowl with One Spoon. Earth into Property, Colonization, Decolonization, and Capitalism is the second volume of the Bowl Project, which was published this last fall by McGill Queen's University Press. Earth into Property explores the relationship between the dispossession of indigenous peoples and the making of global capitalism. With the dismantling of the formal empires of Europe after the Second World War, the U.S. corporate state moved to fill the vacuum of power. Hall shows that the U.S. government, in seeking to replicate its role in the Cold War by mounting the global war on terror, is extending trajectories of conquest that began with invasions of Indian nations to further the expansionary course of American empire. His recent article is entitled Waging the Battle for Reality, a review essay on a propagandist journey in search of a conspiracist underground, which discusses what Professor Hall calls the sacred myth of 9/11 and its relationship to a McCarthyite-type campaign being waged against citizens that reject the officially sanctioned conspiracy theory of 9/11. Dr. Hall, welcome to Indymedia On Air.
Hey, Chris.
I'm glad you can make it all the way down from Canada.
Great to be here. Wonderful to be right in Hollywood.
All right. Well, let's. I'd like to start off about your book, Earth into Property, and read a description of your book, and then we can talk about it. We talked about it briefly in the intro, but it was written: the global operations of the military-industrial complex and the national security state emerged from the ongoing appropriation and corporate privatization of Aboriginal lands and resources on capitalism's moving frontiers. This network of U.S.-based corporations and government agencies continue to draw heavily on the fascist heritage of Nazi anti-communism in its drive to universalize and police a single worldwide regime of unjust property relations. So you see the war on terror as an extension of European colonialism as opposed to a new phase of American imperial project.
Yeah, of course, the early days of imperial globalization, starting with, let's say, 1492 and Christopher Columbus, it's premised on the idea that we're going to civilize these lands. We're going to bring civilization to savages. We're going to bring Christianity or Roman Catholicism to pagan people. And this demonization of the indigenous people standing on the resources that are going to form the commercial basis for these empires, this pattern is repeated again and again. So by the time you get into the period where the United States is moving into the vacuum of power resulting from the dismantling of the European empires after World War II, the rhetoric, the polemic is, well, we're saving the world from communism, and we're civilizing the world with capitalism, sometimes even with Christianity. This global war on terror sort of renews that same rhetoric. And of course, the oil and gas resources in Eurasia, in the Caspian Sea area, for instance, it's like a reversion. Well, we're going in there because there are terrorists there, and we have to cleanse this realm of terrorism and these demonic ideas. And we've seen that before. So we're seeing a replication of the old patterns of empire building, of colonization.
Now, would you argue that this new phase in the global war on terror, this new phase of this colonization, right, of resources for capital, it requires these mythologies to be, made massively public, right? So, for example, the myth of Qaeda. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, the sacred myth of 9/11. Let's remember that 3 days after 9/11, George W. Bush went into the Episcopalian Church in Washington, D.C., and essentially declared war on Al-Qaeda from the pulpit, literally from a Christian pulpit. And it was very much framed as an event where the 3,000 people were martyred by Islamic freaks, jihadists, terrorists, religious extremists, and this has taken on a kind of religious aura that is incorporated in the national myth of the United States, the manifest destiny, the idea that United States is sort of commissioned by God. It has a divine mission in the world. Sometimes we refer to this as manifest destiny. So the sacred myth of 9/11 becomes part of the sort of patriotic religion of a state which has never, it's never quite clear, is it a secular state, is it a religious state, the United States of America? And so it's very hard to get any sort of critical consideration of what actually happened on 9/11, and of course there's a huge movement of people who have come to the conclusion that the official story is not correct, that the buildings didn't fall the way they were supposed to, for instance. That was obviously controlled demolition, especially in the case of Building 7. And so it's very hard to have a kind of rational discussion about the real content of this global war on terror. It's invented as and promoted as essentially a religious war, an ethnic war. And of course, it points attention away from the deeper commercial economic elements, which is always the modus operandi of the imperialists.
You write in your recent article, Waging the Battle for Reality, a review essay on a propagandist journey in search of a conspiracist underground. You take to task a particular writer, and in that article you say the sacred myth of 9/11 helps renew the old imperial ploy of divide and conquer, which is that connection between this pattern of colonization and imperialism, and that this myth helps to further that. Now, and you continue, by highlighting issues of religion and ethnicity as a primary cause of and justification for global conflict, the sacred myth of 9/11 diverts attention away from the huge and growing gap between rich and poor. The sacred myth of 9/11 helps to raise walls of separation that hold back the wretched of the earth from the riches of capitalism's blood diamond elite. It is this vast disparities of material entitlement, not some engineered or trumped up conflict of civilizations, that require our most urgent attention. And I found that really striking, and for a lot of reasons. But let's start with, the word sacred, and I assume you use it because in the context of American cultural life, it is so, like you said, you don't know if you're talking about a religious state or a secular state.
Yeah, I mean, if you start to try to have a conversation with some folks about, well, what happened at Building 7, for instance, the building that came down at 5:20 in the afternoon on 9/11, and you find yourself running into, hey, you're offending me. This is deep in my belief system, and so you can't have a rational discussion about it. The review essay that you're talking about is a response to Jonathan Kay's Among the Truthers. And he would put himself forward as a sort of child of the Enlightenment, of rationality, but I think it's quite the opposite. This 9/11 has created a kind of mythological realm where we're meant to imagine sort of demonic folks planning diabolical things in caves. The very name of the book, that he's dealing with something called the underground conspiracists, harkens back to what we were told, where Osama bin Laden used to hang out in these caves, and all of 9/11 was planned in caves. I mean, this is very reminiscent to me of the era where priests and kings, divine right of kings, they ruled by using these superstitions and mythologies, and individuals, the few individuals who will now defend the story of 9/11, like Jonathan Kay or Michael Shermer, I kind of imagine they might be sort of scholars kept in the Roman Catholic Church to prove, for instance, that Galileo was a heretic, to think that the sun was the center of the planetary system, right, and the Earth wasn't. So I think we've had some really great scholars who look at 9/11. David Ray Griffin leading the sort of citizens investigation. There's an Enlightenment figure, somebody who uses empirical proof, very tight arguments, based on documentary evidence, unlike Jonathan Kay, who says he's holding up a rational tradition, but is in fact renewing this sacred myth. It is the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and so the stakes are high, and obviously you've got, this whole national security state, a huge part of the political economy of the United States built up around, fighting communists. Suddenly the Soviet Union is not there anymore. How are you going to continue to edify and expand and privatize this national security state, which has as its attending apparatus the military-industrial complex? Of course, a big part of the current military-industrial complex is the mainstream media. People have to be dehumanized in the public's imagination if you're going to shoot depleted uranium at them, white phosphorus. If you're going to put them in camps and torture them, you have to create images that they're not quite human. And so this war on terror, based on the idea that 9/11 was the calling card for this new global enemy. Of course, we know that Al-Qaeda came out of the national security state. It was invented in the context of Afghanistan to pay, organize, arm jihadists who would fight the Soviet-backed puppet regime in Afghanistan. That's the history of Al-Qaeda. Somehow we're meant to believe that they somehow got together and resigned from CIA and went off and met independently in caves. To me, this is one of the big lies that we have to address, and we have to see it in a historical context, that the demonization of those from whom you're about to take the resources, you're not going to publicly say that, this is about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and we're going to, in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, King George, I'm going backwards, but cut me a little slack here. 1776, Declaration of Independence, July the 4th. King George did bring on the merciless Indian savages, whose known means of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. It's right in the Declaration of Independence. So the war on terror, you could say, really starts there. The people on top of the resources that are going to be the material base, the commercial base for this new polity called the United States of America, right off the bat, they're criminalized, they're racially profiled, and essentially declared to be anarchistic savages and terrorists who can be counted upon to do arbitrary destruction. So it's very deep in the U.S. Mythological heritage, nationalistic heritage.
Slavery and genocide are the basis for American capitalism.
Yeah, and of course you can look at slavery, and it sort of had a happy ending after the Civil War, that the slaves were freed, but the indigenous people, there's no happy ending. So that story doesn't lend itself to the kind of Hollywood production of happy endings that seem to be the basis of the motion picture industry, for instance.
I'd like to go back to this point real quick about this sort of inversion of the Renaissance ideas, right? Of science and rationality and logic being turned on its head in the context of 9/11. And as many listeners know, on Indymedia on Air, I've covered this issue from a scientific point of view. And what I'm particularly interested in is hearing professionals, architects and engineers and scientists who put their professional name on the line and publicly say that this is not right.
Yeah.
And not only that, we now have data from people like Dr. Harrit from University of Copenhagen, who studied and proven in a peer-reviewed process the presence of active thermitic materials, as they say in the title. So what we have here is we have very strong scientific backing for challenging the official story, and yet we have people who clearly don't have any scientific background using these sort of publicly ad hominem attacks against people like Shermer, like Kay, and every time this issue comes up, they refuse to discuss anything dealing with the actual details
with the
of
actual
the
evidence,
the evidence of the investigation, and this plays into and again that your explanation of the sacred myth, the importance of continuing this mythology of the other that we have to destroy, and who happen to just to be having our resources under their land, so to speak, right? But and then justifying these massive invasions where million people have been killed since the Iraq invasion. Estimates from John Hopkins and other places have suggested. This is and even after the the Osama bin Laden fiasco recently, this national security state continues